In this video, we uncover one of the most brutal gangland murders the UK has ever seen. On the morning of June 19th, 2003, Brian Waters, a devoted father of two, was tortured to death in front of his family inside his own cannabis farm at Burnt House. That fateful morning, Brian arrived in his pickup truck for what should have been a routine check on his newly harvested plants. But waiting inside were 6 masked men. They had already taken hostage his business partner's son, Suleiman Razak, who occasionally worked on the farm alongside Brian's son, Gavin. Razak's ankles were bound to overhead beams, his body suspended upside down. Beside him stood a barrel of filthy water. The men repeatedly plunged his head into it, shocking him with high-voltage electricity as they demanded to know where the money was. But this wasn't a random home invasion. The men had come to recover a £20,000 drug debt that Brian owed to John Wilson, a notorious figure in Cheshire's criminal underworld. He had once trusted Brian to broker drug deals in the Netherlands on his behalf. But when £20,000 in cash was seized by customs at a port in Amsterdam, and Brian couldn't pay it back, the debt became a death wish. What followed would shock Britain and leave his wife and children scarred for life. Brian Waters was remembered by those closest to him as a loving and caring father, someone who would give the shirt off his back for anyone. Before entering the world of cannabis, Brian spent most of his adult life working in construction. However, according to his wife, Julie Waters, he had suffered career-ending injuries on site, though she never revealed the exact circumstances. As the years passed, finding steady work became increasingly difficult. With a family to support and bills to pay, Brian turned to cannabis, dealing in the mid-1990s, a decision born out of necessity. Through this dangerous and lucrative industry, he forged connections with other figures operating on the fringes of the law. By 1998, Brian had established his own cannabis plot in the Netherlands, spending the majority of his time abroad, overseeing the operation and managing his growing enterprise. During his frequent trips between Holland and Britain, Brian crossed paths with John Wilson, a 54-year-old crime boss based in Glossop, Derbyshire. Wilson was a seasoned figure in the underworld, and soon Brian began taking side jobs for him, acting as a go-between with dealers in the Netherlands. At times, he even served as a carrier, smuggling cannabis, both his own and Wilson's, back into Britain, earning a percentage for every successful run. But in the summer of 2002, everything changed. Brian was stopped by customs officers at a port in Amsterdam while carrying £20,000 in cash, money intended for Wilson. Unable to prove where it had come from, the money was seized, and with it, Brian's future was sealed. Months passed after the seizure, and the relationship between Brian and Wilson grew increasingly strained. Brian ignored Wilson's calls and showed no intention of repaying the debt he owed. Wilson's frustration mounted. He knew Brian had the money, yet he had deliberately chosen defiance. By 2002, rumors began to spread that Brian Waters, together with his friend Mujahid Johnny Majid, was running a cannabis farm somewhere in Cheshire. Its precise location was unknown, but the whispers alone were enough to reach John Wilson. For Wilson, a man who ruled through fear and reputation, this was more than idle gossip. It was a challenge to his authority. Determined to make an example of Brian, he began orchestrating a ruthless plan, one designed not only to settle a debt, but to send a chilling message to anyone else who dared to cross him. He turned to cousins, Christopher Guestmore Jr. and James Raven, for assistance in locating Brian's hidden farm. But why them? Because both men had experience in surveillance and deception. They had worked as undercover TV researchers for BBC and Channel 4, secretly infiltrating Cheshire's criminal underworld to gather intelligence for documentary programs. On the surface, they appeared to be investigators, but in reality, they were men with violent criminal pasts. Despite their backgrounds, they were hired and handsomely paid, reportedly up to £500 a day, with one commission said to have earned them more than £50,000. By June 2003, just days before Brian's murder, Christopher and Raven turned their attention to Brian's son, Gavin. They shadowed him around town, convinced he would eventually lead them to the hidden cannabis farm. And on June 10th, their patience finally paid off. The cousins followed Gavin as he drove to his father's home on Mainwaring Close in Nantwich. They lingered outside, waiting. Minutes later, Gavin left again, this time heading straight to Burnt House Farm, the secret cannabis plot where he worked alongside Suleiman Razak, the son of Brian's business partner. Over the following days, the surveillance intensified. Christopher and Raven returned to the property repeatedly, monitoring the comings and goings, studying the routines, and gathering every detail they would need. More than anything, they wanted to know when Brian would be there. It began like any other day for the Waters family. At their home in Nantwich, Brian was with his wife, Julie, and their two children, Gavin, 25, and Natalie, who had just celebrated her 21st birthday the day before. Meanwhile, at Burnt House Farm, the fields lay quiet. No one had arrived yet, but Brian had plans to stop by that morning to check on his freshly harvested cannabis crop. Across town, however, plans of a far darker nature were already in motion. Christopher and Raven had assembled a crew of violent enforcers. Among them was Otis Matthews, a criminal from Stretford, David Moran, a drifter with no fixed address, and 3 other unidentified men who, to this day, have never been brought to justice. The gang set off toward Burnt House Farm in a stolen horse box, Moran behind the wheel. Its purpose was chillingly clear: to strip the property of anything valuable and to settle the debt Brian owed to John Wilson. When the horsebox pulled into Burnt House Farm, the men moved quickly. Dressed in balaclavas, they forced their way inside and began tearing through the property, ransacking rooms for anything of value. But this wasn't a robbery. The gang was lying in wait. Their real target was Brian. As they prepared the scene, an unexpected visitor arrived. Suleiman Razak, the son of Brian's business partner, Mujahid Majid. That morning, he walked straight into an ambush. The masked men overpowered him instantly. He was dragged into the adjacent cowshed, where the questioning began. They demanded money he knew nothing about. A rope was tied around his ankles and thrown over a beam, hoisting his body upside down. A green container of filthy water sat nearby. Time and again, his head was plunged into it, while high-voltage shocks coursed through his body, each jolt forcing out screams they hoped would yield answers. The assault escalated. He was beaten with canes, and phosphoric acid, a caustic chemical often used in cannabis cultivation, was poured onto his back, burning his skin. A staple gun was fired into his flesh. Finally, he was bound to a chair with adhesive tape and subjected to yet another round of savage beatings. By 1 p.m., when Brian arrived at the farm, the gang was fully prepared. What awaited him inside was a fate even more horrifying. As Brian pulled into the farm, he noticed something unusual: an unfamiliar horsebox parked near the entrance. Suspicious, but unaware of the horror that awaited him, he stepped inside. The moment he realized the danger, Brian tried to flee, but it was already too late. The masked men pounced, dragging him into the same cowshed where their first victim had been held. What followed was unrelenting. Brian was savagely beaten with canes. His head was forced into a container of filthy water, again and again, suffocating him while his attackers demanded £20,000 he owed Wilson. They hoisted him upside down, fired staples into his skin, and bound him tight. His face was covered with a plastic bag, which they briefly set alight. Then came an act of sheer cruelty. An iron bar was forced inside Brian's rectum so far that it struck the base of his spine, an injury which pathologists later confirmed must have caused unimaginable pain. Screams of agony filled the shed, echoing across the farmyard, but no one came, no one heard. Later that day, Gavin and his sister Natalie arrived at the farm, walking straight into the nightmare. They were attacked immediately. Gavin was punched and kicked to the ground. A rope was pulled tight around his neck, choking him so violently that he nearly lost consciousness. Natalie endured her own terror. A gun, later recovered from the scene, was shoved into her mouth as the gang threatened her with unspeakable violence. Both siblings could see the horrifying state of their father. Brian was gravely injured, his body broken, his pain unbearable. At one point, he begged his attackers to loosen his restraints, gasping that he could not breathe. One of them obliged, but by then, it was far too late. In front of his own children, Brian Waters drew his final breath. His lifeless body was dragged across the yard and dumped on the floor of the adjacent milking parlor, discarded like nothing more than a warning. Meanwhile, two of the assailants had taken Brian's truck and driven straight to Mainwaring Close. Forcing their way inside, they confronted Brian's wife, Julie, holding her against her will as they tore through the house, searching desperately for cash. But the search yielded nothing. Unsatisfied, they kidnapped Julie and drove her back to Burnt House Farm, delivering her into the same nightmare that had already engulfed her husband and children. Outside, however, not everyone in the gang was willing to face the consequences. David Moran, stationed as a lookout, dialed 999. But rather than confessing his role, Moran posed as an innocent bystander who had just witnessed a crime. On the phone with dispatchers, he calmly reported the attack, trying to distance himself from the savagery unfolding inside.
2252.
Thank you. Hello, please.
Hello, hiya. I've just come off the M6 for Manchester Airport. I'm not sure the junction's 18.
Yeah.
Going towards Northwich, is it the A556?
Yes.
I've got up there, and the first farm on the right-hand side,
Yep.
it was about 500 yards. It looked like there was three men beating somebody up in the courtyard.
All right.
It didn't look right.
So if you come off at junction 18 and take the 556, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's 18.
It's 19, that one, actually, I think.
19, yeah, 556.
Yeah.
About 500 yards on the right,
Yeah.
going towards Northwich,
Yeah.
to the farmyard, and that's just like these three gentlemen, or three men,
Right.
attacking a man.
How long ago was that?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes ago. Okay, so what's your name, please?
I'd rather not get involved,
No, fair enough. Okay, I'll look into it for you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, bye.
Thank you, bye.
Shortly after, police arrived at Burnt House Farm. Chaos erupted. The gang scattered in all directions, sprinting across the surrounding fields. James Raven was detained nearby, but the others managed to escape into the countryside. In their haste, they left behind a trail of evidence: DNA on gloves, hats hanging from the rafters, and countless other traces linking them to the scene. There was no time to clean up, no way to hide what had happened inside the farm. The walls were closing in. Brian endured 3 hours of unimaginable torture before he died. A post-mortem examination revealed the scale of his suffering: 123 external injuries in total. His body was marked with bruises, abrasions, lacerations, and deep-cut wounds. The chest and back were covered in tramline bruising, consistent with repeated blows from canes. There were clear signs of strangulation. His ribs had been shattered, 11 on the left side, 15 on the right. One lung had collapsed, while the other was filling with blood. Pathologists also discovered catastrophic internal damage, tearing to the anus and rectum. Injuries so severe, they confirmed an iron bar had been forced into his body. Brian's death was the result of the cumulative effects of these multiple injuries. Miraculously, Suleiman Razak survived the ordeal, though he was left with devastating physical injuries. Just 2 days later, as the hunt began, Christopher was captured on CCTV at an airport alongside his unsuspecting girlfriend. Using a fake passport in the name of Andrew Christopher Lamb, he boarded a flight to Spain, eventually believed to have settled in Malaga. Back in Cheshire, the investigation was intensifying. News of the horrific crime had spread across the country, shocking the public, not only because of the brutality, but because it was clear this was no random attack. But it wasn't long before the authorities began making arrests. John Wilson, the mastermind behind the attack, and Otis Matthews were charged with the murder of Brian Waters and the attempted murder of Suleiman Razak. Their cases, along with that of James Raven, were brought before Chester Crown Court. In September 2004, the trials reached their conclusion. Wilson and Raven were found guilty on both charges. Each was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 24 years before being eligible for parole. Matthews' path to conviction was more complex. His first trial ended with a hung jury, but in 2006 he faced retrial. This time he was found guilty of murder and attempted murder and was handed a life sentence with a minimum term matching those of Wilson and Raven. The remaining attackers successfully evaded capture. Meanwhile, the convicted men maintained their innocence, insisting they had no knowledge of the fugitives' identities or whereabouts. For the authorities, it would be a 16-year wait before a breakthrough came. One of the masterminds of the attack, living a seemingly lavish life abroad, would finally be brought to justice. For nearly 16 years, Christopher Guestmore Jr. remained on the run, moving across Europe under false identities. Living in luxury, he appeared untouchable, evading law enforcement and blending into his surroundings. But in 2019, investigators finally caught a break. CCTV and intelligence reports traced him to Malaga, Spain, where he had been living under the name Andrew Christopher Lamb. Authorities moved quickly to detain him, coordinating an international operation to bring him back to the UK. Once extradited, Moore Jr. faced trial for the murder of Brian Waters and the attempted murder of Suleiman Razak. The court heard chilling details of his involvement: the surveillance, the planning, and the execution of one of Britain's most brutal gangland murders. In December 2021, the verdict was delivered. Christopher Guestmore Jr. was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 24 years, finally closing a 16-year chapter of evasion, terror, and justice delayed. The murder of Brian Waters left a trail of devastation that extended far beyond the crime scene. A devoted father and husband was brutally tortured and killed, his children and wife forced to witness horrors that would scar them for life. For the Waters family, life would never be the same. Trust shattered, innocence stolen, and memories haunted by violence. They were left to pick up the pieces of a world turned upside down. Justice, though delayed, eventually arrived.